Welcome everyone, Costini here with a discussion about the Dark Elves in patch 3.1, which Creative Assembly have remade for the sake of Immortal Empires. Now, a lot of people have disliked the Dark Elves in Warhammer 3 compared to Warhammer 2 because in Warhammer 2 they could certainly abuse their economy to earn ridiculous sums of money. That's still no longer the case. You still can't exploit the economy in the same way, but what they have done is certainly given the Dark Elves a major buff to their economy, to their economic potential. And that is, of course, through the slave system. A lot of people have disliked the slave system as it has been introduced in Warhammer 3. Now, what they've done is they've taken inspiration from the Chaos Dwarves. Though it's not the same system as the Chaos Dwarves, you still don't have slaves in individual province, you still have a global meter. Now, how this used to work is that you would have a global pool of slaves, but with caps that were dependent on how many buildings you control, how many main settlement buildings you control, how many black arcs you controlled. Those would increase your slave capacity. Furthermore, slaves are being consumed by your main economic buildings as well as by your ports. That's no longer the case right now in patch 3.1, at least for ports. There have been quite a few changes made. So, here's what they've done. They've changed the global pool of slaves from just giving you negatives in terms of control to giving you positives at a low level of control. Like if you have a low level of slaves, if you have a low slave population, you get plus 3 control. As you go higher, that control starts diminishing. So you're still going to have downsides. I think it goes from plus 3 to minus 3, though not entirely certain. Because typically speaking, I would say you're probably not going to have a ridiculous amount of slaves every single turn, nor should you, because there's a lot of benefits in using slaves in your empire every single turn for dictats. Now, the dictats have been changed in the sense that the cost of using those dictats has been lowered. But because you now get the control benefit at a low slave population, you're not just constantly enabling fight to death for extra control. Rather, what you're probably going to be doing is you're probably going to use open markets a lot to just print money. This is going to be absurdly powerful as it is for the Chaos Dwarves. So the Chaos Dwarves can generate a ridiculous sum of money in their economy by just selling slaves, by using labor actions. And now that's what the Dark Elves can do as well. Though the cost of dictats is affected by the slave pens building. So what the slave pens building would do is obviously it affected your control, as it still does, but it would give you some slaves and crucially increase slave capacity. And it's also the building you need in order to be able to use the Black Arc right. Now, the Black Arc right still requires a slave market, and it still has a pretty hefty cooldown with it. In fact, I think its cooldown might have actually been increased, or it always was 25 turns. Could be wrong on that, but either way, it doesn't matter. Dark Elves were already a really powerful race. Now what they've done is they've literally given them the ability of printing money. They already had it, but the problem with using open markets is because of the poor control you would have in your territory, a lot of times you couldn't use it, right? Now, however, because you get the control benefit when you're at a low slave count, you absolutely can. Furthermore, what they've done with ports is they no longer consume slaves, they generate slaves. Now, the extra income from ports has been removed, so their income could be considered a bit worse, like their passive income, but generating slaves means you're literally printing money because you can use those slaves for open markets. And overall, the Dark Elf economy, I would say, has been buffed in a fairly substantial way. Now, they did get a construction cost benefit with a high level of slaves. That has been removed. But instead, we get instant construction. What this means really is that the Dark Elves are now one of the most powerful races in the early game. See, the Chaos Dwarves are limited because they can't get their best units early game regardless of what they can do. The Dark Elves can get some of the best units pretty damn quickly, and now they get instant construction if they're using slaves. Now, the costs can be considered relatively high, depends on the building you're talking about. But you basically can take, if you have a building slot, an open building slot in a particular province, you can build something there instantly. So for instance here, I've built the Cultist Gathering, instantly built it, got it to tier 2, and now let's just get it to tier 3. That's probably been 1,000 slaves, but now I have death hags in this particular province instantly. This is absurdly strong for the Dark Elves because Dark Elves can get heroes at the fairly low tier. You just need a tier 3 settlement for the most part unless you're playing Morathi, in which case the only hero you can't get at tier 3 are the Knight Assassins. So you can construct buildings instantly, and getting to a low slave count is not necessarily a downside. In fact, it can be considered an upside, because if you have a low slave count, then your control is going to be boosted, so you're not going to face as many issues in your empire. So they've taken a race that was already really good in early game aggression and made them far stronger, at least on land. One of the problems the Dark Elves had, I would argue, is that they were too dependent on their black arcs, but now with instant building construction through slaves, you can get to tier 3 barracks, you can recruit a lot of units via land, you can also buff your economy in a substantial way. But there are certainly downsides. It's not just a buff without any downsides. What's the downside? Well, ports no longer consume slaves, but your main economic building, however, has been somewhat nerfed, at least at a low level. What they've done is at tier 3, you're still going to generate the same amount of money as you did before, which is 700 income. But the thing is, at a low level, it's going to be less, but that's not necessarily too big of an issue because Dark Elves have good growth, so it's pretty easy to get to tier 2. Like tier 1, yeah, it's something of a nerf, but tier 2, tier 3, you're still generating the same amount of money, but you do need to get a high level of slaves. You do need to get a high level of to get a high level of slaves, or to get a certain amount of slaves to maintain the your economy. So if you're going below your slave consumption, if you're consuming more slaves than you have at that point, your economy is going to start going freefall. But look at this situation. Like, outside of the fact that I've spent 2,500 for building construction over here, I only am spending 143 slaves per turn at the moment in my empire, and I'm generating slaves through the ports. And on top of that, my Knight Assassin over here, his passive slave generation has been increased. So you're generating more slaves passively in your empire. You have better control. You don't have the same construction cost benefit, but you do have instant construction, and I would say instant construction is generally much stronger, because if you, let's say, take a settlement and you can build an economic building from nothing to tier 3 in a single turn instantly, that is ridiculously strong, because you're instantly going to generate 700 income over there through that building. It depends on whether or not the race you're attacking, the settlements you're taking, do have buildings that you can, that can convert. Depends on who you are fighting and how you're fighting them. But it is a ridiculous amount of power in particular land, but you're still very much a naval aggressor, because you do want port settlements, because you do want the slave generation through those ports. That is still certainly the case at the moment in Warhammer 3. But yeah, the Dark Elves, already I ranked them as an S tier race. I know a lot of people disagreed with that sentiment, but I think right now they're certainly a S tier plus race at the moment in the game, given everything that has been changed to them. Like, just the instant construction, the amount of money they can print is ridiculously good. It's ridiculously strong. Now, there's some other downsides, of course, as well. So your main control building, for Morathi, she has a special control building with the Cultist Gathering that allows you to recruit Death Hags. The way it works right now is that it has a slave consumption. Your main growth building also has a slave consumption. It isn't too big of a deal, but it is something to be aware of if you're going to do so. But I would not be too worried about that. Like, you may get one control building in a province or two control buildings, and it's not going to consume so many slaves. And hell, if you have a port in that province, that's more than going to make up for it. But now you're more dependent on having slaves than ever, but you at least have, you can also take it, have a more relaxed campaign because you do have a decent amount of slave generation, passive slave generation. Like right here, I only need to have 78 slaves. I only need to get 78 slaves per turn to not run out of them. And it's like every battle that I fought has generated me 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. Like over here with Vol's Anvil, I defeated the Sisters of Twilight, and I took over the settlement, and that's like 1,000 slaves over here that I've just generated. So that there is still a ridiculous amount of slaves that you do have access to in every single turn. As long as you can fight one battle per turn, you're probably going to be in a pretty okay spot when it comes to your slave generation. That's not going to be an issue going forward if you're playing the Dark Elves. So yeah, pretty significant buff. It also gives you more choice, more consequences when it comes to those choices, because if you go too far ahead, if you spend too many slaves every single turn, if you're ending up at a slave deficit, your economy is going to start collapsing. So you do need to be careful about that, but you don't need to have a ridiculous number of slaves anymore. And you no longer have the annoyance. I'd say this is the biggest thing. You no longer have the annoyance of the slave caps, because it is very easy to earn a lot of slaves, especially as Morathi or Loki or Felhard, because they get a lot of casualties post-battle. You no longer have the annoyance of like you're constantly reaching the cap every single turn in a campaign previously. Now, however, you can go way, way beyond that cap with the obvious downsides of control. But that's not too big of an issue, I would argue. That is all there is to say on it. I think the Dark Elves are a great race. I think they were already a great race. Now they've just been made stronger. Costine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.